Everyone, my name is Jeremiah Carrig, and I'm a member of Socialist Action in Vancouver, British Columbia. And I also work as a community educator with progressive organizations here that are focused on Filipino migrant workers here in Vancouver, specifically Sulong UBC, which is allied with Anak Bayan Canada, and also work closely as an arts and community educator for Migrant BC, which is part of a global organization advocating for migrant workers' rights and other migrant workers. Tonight's webcast is titled The Exploitation and Resistance of Migrant Workers. I am your host, and I will be joined by Pauline Corpus, and will also be joined later by Gabriel Aladua, who will be coming in later. I will be speaking for about 15 minutes. Our guests will speak for about 10 minutes each, after which we will then go to questions from the online audience. Audience members can submit a question by accessing the webcast directly from YouTube and by typing the question directly on that chat column. We welcome all your questions. Our presenters will do their best to answer them. If you like this webcast, please subscribe to Socialist Action YouTube channel. And if you agree with what you hear during this program, please join Socialist Action by signing up on our website, www.socialistaction.ca, and by calling 647-986-1917. So let's begin with my presentation. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking on the territories of the Coast Salish people. And I think it's important to make that acknowledgement because it's important to align the struggle of migrant workers with those of Indigenous people, because we are experiencing the same oppression or similar plight and experience, because our stories of displacement and oppression are very much a product of colonialism, the histories of colonialism, and also the ongoing oppression that happens through the structures of imperialism and capitalism. Let me begin to talk about the resistance of migrant workers first by talking a bit about the history of migrant worker and exploitation and looking at it at a global level, seeing what its effects are to these countries that are sending these migrant workers to richer imperialist countries. And eventually I will get to the Canadian context and explain what's exactly happening within these borders and what are these migrant workers doing in order to resist and in order for them to fight for their rights. So let me start by their history. So as you know, migration has always been a crucial part of capitalism and colonialism. And we have seen waves of migration from Europe to North America and Australia in the 19th century. However, in the beginning of the era of imperialism, we have seen a different shape of this migration, as most of these people are now coming from poor, mostly colonial or semi-colonial countries, moving towards rich imperialist countries. In fact, the crisis-ridden development in the early 1970s and the onset of globalization has seen a substantial increase in migration. In fact, migrant worker populations grew from 5.2% in 1960 to about 14% in 2010 in the United States. Most of these migrant workers now live and work in two imperialist regions, and that is North America, which of course Canada is a part of, and Western Europe. Migration becomes part of this exploitative process of the semi-colonial world, what we would refer to countries in Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe, and most countries in Asia by global imperialist and monopolistic capital. We call them semi-colonial because while these are actually sovereign states on paper, they're actually politically and economically dependent on the rich imperialist states. In Probsting's work, The Great Robbery of the South, he talks about the ways that imperialist capital draws profit by exploiting migrant workers, wherein they're paid below the value of their labor force. Number one, capitalists don't typically have to spend on their education or training, as most of them are educated and trained in their home countries. Thus, they don't need to make an investment on that. Number two, these capitalists have to pay either none or reduced costs for benefits and other social security expenditures, as most of these migrant workers have limited access to these services or are not even eligible to them due to status. And what's worse is that capitalists are able to pay them significantly lower than the wages prescribed by the ruling nation. And this could be the case because for a variety of reasons. Number one, they may not be citizens of the imperialist country or even have resident status, thus the same laws do not apply to them. Number two, there are other barriers that are in their way, like say, for instance, the migrant's mother language may not be treated as an equal or serves as a barrier from them in obtaining jobs that are commensurate to their educational and professional training. And lastly, because of the mechanisms of the state, they are further isolated due to social discrimination, thus making it harder for them to seek allies and even for them to organize and mobilize. Thus, this results to a large majority of migrant workers belonging to the lower layers of the working class. And what's worse is through the mechanism of capitalism, capitalists further differentiate these workers from the rest of the labor force, and thus establishing some sort of labor aristocracy. So in common parlance, we call them sort of the managers, the bureaucrats, and by bribing this top layer of the working class for higher wages, corporation shares, capitalists are able to further this exploitative system. So as I'm speaking, I would like to clarify that in this specific discussion, I would like to differentiate the kind of migrant workers that we're going to talk about, as this oppression that we are discussing applies only to workers coming from countries, from impoverished nation states, and does not apply to rich imperialist countries that share similar identities with the ruling nation's majority population. Sometimes we call them expats, and we think of expats that are coming from the same rich imperialist countries, they experience great benefits and probably get jobs that are commensurate to their education and work experience. It's important to make this differentiation from here on, because not only is this a migrant worker struggle, but this is to showcase that this is a race and class struggle involving migrant workers. But some people may argue that conditions for migrant workers may be better in rich imperialist countries than their home countries. Of course, that's never a justification, but to a certain extent, yes. But economically, these migrant workers are basically getting crumbs from the super profits of these rich imperialist countries. And more so, this process of exploitation that's already happening in their home countries is just being extended towards, it's just being extended as they now reside and work in these rich imperialist countries. Now, I'd like to, before I even get to the Canadian example, I would like to talk about sort of the global impact of the surgence of migrant workers, because there's a greater impact for this on the global scale. Because of this, because of migrant worker, because of the increase in migration of labor, imperialist countries have gained, by migration of educated professionals from the south to the north, about 51 billion in human capital between 1961 and 1972 alone. So we're not even talking about current times. And in fact, the World Bank reports that about 23,000 African academics are leaving their countries every year, such that there are now more scientists living in the United States than in Africa. So as you can imagine, this is definitely detrimental in terms of seeing growth and development in these countries and in giving them the competitive edge, thus putting them even further behind these rich imperialist countries. Also, with this current system, remittances now form a major part of the economy for these developing nations. In fact, according to calculations by the International Organization for Migration, about $414 billion was transferred in 2009 by migrants to their home countries, which is about 3 times more than typical foreign aid accorded to these countries. And what's even scarier is it is really quite enticing to exploit migrant labor. A study from the World Bank itself in 2006 by Len Pritchett said that by just letting in 3% more migrant workers, these rich imperialist countries would be able to gain about $51 billion in capital boost to return to capital and reduce cost production. So the problem with this capitalistic system is that it is actually providing an incentive. So when decisions are done and they're very much profit focused, then then all the ethics and all the morality behind like hiring labor is like thrown to the side, and basically, and this is the reason why this exploitation is pervasive. Now we move to Canada. Sometimes like we would often think about exploitative labor outside our borders, but the interesting thing is that it is very much happening in our in this country, and it's been happening for quite some time. The system in Canada in particular invites many kinds of abuses. So whether it's lower or unpaid wages, limited access to healthcare, unsafe working conditions, crowded accommodations, abusive working conditions, questionable payroll deductions, and even non-payment of accrued overtime. For this particular example, I would like to focus with a temporary foreign program, which is already exploitative in the beginning, as it has established itself as its own industrial complex, beginning from when these foreign workers are applying for employment as migrant workers in these rich imperialist countries. Because even from there, they're already being charged these exorbitant these fees range anywhere from $6,000 to about $12,000. Just to give you an idea, compared to the minimum wages in the Philippines, it's about 11.62. A typical Filipino worker earning minimum wage is earning about $11.62 Canadian dollars every day. So just compare that to the $6,000 to $12,000. And from that very beginning, you can already see how it establishes some sort of bondage that these workers have towards their debtors, which already puts them at a disadvantaged starting point. Most of these workers work on farms, meat plants, they're nannies, caregivers, and cashiers and fast food outlets. And often people would classify them into sort of the 3 Ds. And these are the dirty, difficult, and dangerous jobs. In 2018, there were about 500,000 migrant workers with temporary status in Canada coming from about 80 source countries. And of that number, about 110,000 are low wage. So you can imagine the magnitude and number and how our industries are very much dependent on this kind of labor. And you might think this might be a new thing, but migrant labor farm exploitation has been happening for quite some time. And actually started about 1966 when you think about the 264 Jamaican men that came to work in Ontario. I think what's different and what's more alarming is that a trend in 2006 started where, due to a change in the system, the number of migrant workers with temporary status now far exceeds the number of economic immigrants granted permanent resident status. So, thus differentiating, the plight of these temporary foreign workers in comparison to other migrant workers. There are different programs under this temporary foreign worker program. There's the live-in caregiver program. There's a seasonal agricultural workers program, and there's also programs that sort of like a wider breadth of industries, and they call it a program requiring lower levels of formal training. And the issue with these particular programs is that they are not necessarily affording, besides them affording temporary foreign worker status to these migrant workers, not all of them also have a clear pathway towards permanent residence or even citizenship. In this light, I would like to emphasize that, when the exploitation comes starting from the agencies that these that these migrant workers are coming from, it does move over to the jurisdiction within the state. And what's happening is that it is a product of the choices made by the federal and provincial governments by changing this immigration system. So I think it's important that this country must rethink workers' eligibility for permanent residence and ensure that workers have accessible pathways towards citizenship. Earlier, I was talking about sort of the differentiation of labor classes, and specifically to migrant workers. I've mentioned that there are the temporary foreign workers, but on the other hand, you also have other workers coming from different classes. You have the federal skilled worker class, Canadian experience class, which a lot of them are graduates of post-secondary institutions here in Canada, the investor class, which I would call basically capitalist, people have enough money to invest, and the provincial nominee program. And all of these programs provide immediate permanent resident status, thus immediately differentiating them to these temporary foreign workers. And thus, this further isolates them. And you can see even within, for instance, similar races and similar communities, like say, for instance, the Filipino community, you can see already sort of a division because there are those that come in through these different programs. And with the policies that are instigated by our laws, I think what happens is a further division of these, and thus renders organizing and mobilizing these communities to work together to advocate for better labor conditions really difficult. But in spite of this, migrant workers continue to resist. And they're doing a lot of work together with the help of different advocacy organizations, and that they are doing their best to fight against this kind of oppression. In fact, I think what happened with COVID-19 is a lot of them have been able to bring up their concerns and expose the impoverished conditions. Take for instance the Cargill meat plant in Alberta, which led to this tremendous COVID-19 outbreak that has exposed, the deplorable working conditions that they have, that these workers are living in close quarters, thus helping spread the disease even more. The same thing happened with these farmer workers. Similar thing happened to these care workers that needed to work in different care homes, and because of the lack of permanency in their work, and that they need to take on more than one job, thus helping spread the disease. So I think there were a lot of examples that basically really put these things to the surface. But I think that the issue and the problem is that, as I've discussed earlier, because these folks don't have status, it is really difficult for them to mobilize. A lot of them, their stay here in Canada is very much dependent on their work permit, and a lot of that isn't very much dependent on the employer that they're tied to. So if they complain or they organize or they put forth their concerns, they could easily lose this and be sent back to their home countries. And as I discussed earlier, there's also sort of this long list of people that if you're thinking about them to be able to recoup those agency fees that they have to pay and all the expenses that they have to pay about moving, or even the potential of saving money in order for them to be able to be reunited with their families here. I think that the conditions, both the laws, the financial restrictions that they have, really make it difficult for them to be able to stand up and to speak up. So a lot of them are really scared, and even with the help of these different organizations, they still encounter these difficulties. So I think it's important. Allow me to propose like a few things that I think needs to happen. Well, number one, I think it is time to call out the state's oppressive policies and the employers and capitalists that exploit these workers. And this happens from the domestic realm, right? Because you have care workers that work in homes that are very much underpaid. Not all of them are entitled to overtime pay. And this also goes to big food and agricultural companies that continue to benefit through migrant worker labor. This is truly exploitative, and we must call out these companies, and also how both the state and these capitalists are basically collaborating towards the exploitation of these workers. Time to reconsider our immigration policies to make sure that these workers are eligible for permanent residence. That they have accessible pathways to citizenship. I mean, if these folks are good enough to care for our children, care for our elderly, help us be fed, sheltered, and all of that, and then I think they deserve to stay here, and they deserve to have respectable working conditions. I think it is also time for the Canadian labor movement to be aware of this exploitation that's happening and to lend a voice to these migrant workers, especially while they still don't have status and they still have these limited platforms to air. I think as socialists and internationalists, we need to build a stronger and united working class alliance. And I think most of all, as I mentioned earlier, the workers and the continued coming of migrant workers, which will further lead to their exploitation, is really a fight against a larger imperialist and capitalist structure. As we have outlined, that the surge in migrant workers in their oppression is very much the mechanism of continued oppression and dependence on these imperialist countries. So as you can see, the fact that these countries, developing countries are dependent on the remittances of these migrant workers, there's this relationship that is basically oppressive. And so I think it's important for us as internationalists and socialists, not only are we addressing the plight of these migrant workers, but also and other ills that are being perpetuated in these capitalistic and imperialistic systems. So I would like to now take the opportunity to analysts and to hear from them. So Pauline Corpus, welcome to the show. I understand that you are a political activist in the Philippines and currently a community, and you also ran for city council in 2018. What can you tell us about the exploitation and resistance of migrant workers?
Yes, I will speak solely about the Filipino community because that's where I am more comfortable. Although the situation that they are suffering are also situations that all other countries from the South or the colonized ones are also experiencing. So I say our temporary foreign workers are modern heroes because of all the things that they contribute to prop up the economy of their country of origin. But in COVID times, they are also being treated as criminals. And overall, I think they are modern slaves, modern heroes and modern slaves. So Filipinos are known for their hard work, subservience, and gratitude. They work and contribute to the economy in so many ways. They are healthcare workers, caregivers, personal support workers, nurses, physiotherapists, lab technicians, and more. They are farm workers. They work in fisheries. They are the grocery store workers. They are factory workers. They are all around you. But for Filipinos, we seem to not see them or hear them. So they're modern heroes, but modern slaves. So to sum up probably my presentation, and this is mostly articulated in this statement from the founding Congress of the International Migrants Alliance in Hong Kong in July 2008, and the International Assembly of Migrants and Refugees in September of the same year, that serves to expose the concerted international policies promoting the migration of workers and their devastating impact. It is true then, and it is also true now. So here are the excerpts that I took from that because of time constraint. I know I have only 10 minutes. This is what they stated in their statement. The founding Congress of the International Migrants Alliance in Hong Kong in July 2008 and the International Assembly of Migrants and Refugees in September 2008 serves to expose the concerted international policies promoting migration of workers and their devastating impact. We have seen how the imperialist foreign wealthy countries have actually put a positive spin on this massive forced migration and commodification of workers, and have the gall to call it a tool for development. We know that in fact it bleeds the countries of the South of their workforce, decimates families, and is one way to preventing real development from taking place in the South, and of maintaining imperialist control and uneven distribution of power and wealth in the world. Canada is an eager partner in the imperialist system and a long-time recipient of this benefit from the South, particularly the Philippines. In 2007, the Philippines became the #1 source of migrants and immigrants to Canada. For over 5 decades, Filipinos have been migrating to Canada. They came as immigrants at first, mostly professionals, office, and factory workers in the 1960s, when many settled in Winnipeg. From the 1980s, there was a sharp rise in their numbers. This corresponded to the Philippine labor exports policy and a special temporary foreign workers program in Canada that brought in mainly women to work as nannies, caregivers, and maids. Known as the Foreign Worker Program in Canada, that brought in many women, known as the Domestic Movement Program in 1980 to 1992, and more recently as the Live-in Caregiver Program 1992 to 2008, and I know it also changed recently. It has allured that generally found in temporary worker, not generally found in temporary worker programs in other recipient countries. If offered the possibility of landed immigrant status, if one could put up with the indentured labor-like conditions of a mere 2 or 3 years. These conditions can be oppressive, exploitative, racist, and heartless. Philippine community groups that have organized to denounce this program and these conditions and to defend the rights and welfare of Filipino migrants in Canada. That's what they're saying. However, as we focus on these most exploited of workers, the LCPS, the Living Caregiver, and the program that turns them into a captive workforce in Canada, the Canadian ruling class has been concocting a program and policies that in many ways are even worse. The appetite of the Canadian ruling class for vulnerable foreign workers in precarious status has grown beyond the LCP and the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, encouraged by the imperialist consensus in favor of labor, force, and mobility. Since 2002, when the Canadian government brought in force the new Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, a series of measures that have been adopted to expand the temporary foreign worker program to virtually all sectors of workers. Canada's immigration policy is shifting away from the recruiting immigrants and permanent residents in favor of recruiting masses of temporary foreign workers. Permanent residency is being reserved for the highly skilled and the rich. In 2006, the federal government allocated over $50 million to speed up the recruitment of temporary foreign workers. It set up special teams and resources in several cities dedicated to TFW recruitment, fast-tracked the process of labor market opinions required, and lengthened the duration of visas for the TFC from 1 year to 2 years. So a brief history, like Jeremiah was saying, Canada is a country of immigrants. In 2006, approximately 20% of the population in Canada was foreign-born, a higher proportion than any other country except Australia. The vast majority of its citizens are descendants of immigrants and migrants, except for the indigenous people who make up for 4% of the population. Canada has always tailored its immigration policies to the needs of capital, from the need to establish European colonial interests here from the 16th to 19th centuries, to the need to build a nation from post-Indian bourgeoisie and the need to industrialize it after World War II. Vast waves of immigrants and migrants came to work and stay, forming the population today. This history is paved with discrimination and racism against, for example, the Chinese workers who were brought in to build the railroad across Canada in the late 19th century. At least one worker perished to each mile of track laid through the Rocky Mountains because of the dangerous working condition. The racist Chinese had taxed and Chinese Exclusion Act prohibited them from bringing their families to Canada for decades. It was only in the 1960s that the last vestiges of these laws against Chinese settlement in Canada were lifted. So, of course, systemic racism has remained. Canada dramatically expanded the list of occupations under which workers could be recruited on temporary restricted visas. The result is that the federal government, with the tacit support and encouragement of provincial governments and employers, has created a guest work program that far outstrips the United States. In 2006, the entire US had 160,000 guest workers, and Canada had 171,844. That year, for the first time, more temporary foreign workers were admitted to Canada than new economic immigrants. What most Canadians do not yet understand is the scale of the government's involvement in bringing workers into Canada on restrictive temporary permits and the consequences of those workers. Are severely limited in their ability to change employers, and is difficult, if not impossible, to apply for permanent immigration status. The use of labor brokers or recruitment agencies had led to the proliferation of operators who see the opportunity for making a fast buck. Brokers are largely unregulated, and TFWs have paid exorbitant fees for placement. Canada must also compete with other countries to draw in highly skilled and professional workers. It has created the Canadian Experience class to hold on to foreign students who have studied in Canada and skilled workers who came as temporary foreign workers and acquired Canadian experience. They are offered immigrant status. The provinces can also sponsor TFWs as immigrants under the provincial nominee program. But this remains a piecemeal measure and does not reverse the clear trend of a two-tier immigration system. The TFWP is employer-driven and job-specific. Because Jeremiah has already mentioned about the dirty and difficult, dangerous jobs that the TFW or the temporary foreign workers are experiencing. I'm passing that statement. So let's jump up. In whose interest are these changes for? Big business, the Canadian monopoly bourgeoisie, engineering, construction, service corporations involved in infrastructure preparations, the oil and gas sectors corporations, the subcontractors, service companies catering to the workers. This demand is supposedly temporary and project-related, but it has remained. Other sectors of business that have benefited here are the healthcare, meat packing, food transportation, construction. This demand is more long-term, and there are contradictions between provincial government and the federal temporary foreign workers program. Do I still have time, or yeah? So in terms of the Filipino workers, their struggle is two-pronged. They have to fight the labor export policy program of the Philippines, where people are the number one and the major export of the Philippines to the whole world. So they are struggling against that. That's why they needed to participate in the political changes that need to happen in the Philippines. And they needed also to struggle against the unjust and unfair policies that our government, the Canadian government, has for the temporary foreign workers. And for the resistance, the number one, number one, I guess, force for us to resist these unjust and unfair practices and the conditions and raise the conditions of the TWP is to get allies, to unite labor, community, and really work towards change in policy. So I know that there are several organizations in Canada who are really fighting for the migrant workers, and this is from different communities. I guess I can stop there. I think 2 minutes. Okay. So that's part of the excerpts of the International Migrant Alliance, and that is basically a summary of the international situation of temporary foreign workers. Thank you.
Good evening.
Oh, no, not
Good
yet.
evening.
Not yet. Not yet.
Okay.
Thank you so much for those insights, Pauline. Thank you for providing more historical context for this specific Canadian example, and also giving very specific information on what's happening with Filipino migrant workers. We also have another panelist joining us, Gabriel Aladua. Welcome, and I know he's coming in via phone due to some technical difficulties. I know you're a former migrant farm worker, now you're an organizer with a collective Justice for Migrant Workers. You also joined the steering committee of the Black Creek Community Farm to advance the cause of Canadian food system that is healthy, sustainable, and just. I think you're familiar with the situation of migrant farm workers in Windsor, Essex County, where 2 workers died recently of COVID-19. What is happening over there?
Okay. Good evening, everyone who's listening land tonight. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. And it's only people who are concerned about a society that is fair, that is just, would organize such a forum. And to you, the participants, this forum is nothing without you. And I'm really grateful and thankful for your participation. I want to tell you that once migrant workers are involved in the food that you eat, in PEI, it's lobster, it's potatoes, in Niagara Falls, it's wine, and different provinces, different products. Once migrant workers are involved in the production of these things, there are 20 injustices associated with the things that migrant farm workers come to Canada and produce. I want to tell you the program that brought me to Canada is called the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. But first of all, my name is Gabriel. I'm from a very small island named St. Lucia, which is in the Caribbean. And St. Lucia takes part in that program, the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. But Jamaica, that program started in Jamaica in 1966, and Jamaica contributes close to 25% of those workers. And roughly 75% of those workers under that program are Spanish-speaking people. And roughly on average, anything between 30 and 40,000 people come on the program, on the migrant farm workers. So I was telling you, the program that brought me to Canada is the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, and that program, as I just said, started in 1966. Listen to the 3 pillars of that program. 1, the program is there because they are bringing us to do jobs Canadians do not want to do. And what are the jobs Canadians do not want to do? All the D jobs you can think of. The dirty jobs, the difficult jobs, the dangerous jobs. And all of those D jobs, they are non-unionized jobs. Question, can you imagine the working conditions associated with non-unionized work? And that is the nature of the work that migrant farm workers do. So the second pillar is, we are here to do jobs Canadians don't want to do, but we do not have right to apply for starters. In Canada, if you have starters, you have certain rights. In Canada, if you don't have status, you don't have certain rights. So imagine we are here to do those dirty jobs and we do not have rights to apply for rights in Canada. And what is Canada? Canada on the world stage portrays itself as a champion for human rights, a champion for people who are in difficult situations to come and have a new start. That's how Canada portrays itself. But quietly, Canada has conditions in place, unjust laws, unjust policies that perpetuate 18th century working conditions. So the first pillar here, first of all, I said we're here to do jobs Canadians do not want to do. We cannot apply for status or we cannot apply for rights. And the first thing is we are tied to our employer. Our work permit ties us to our employer. So let me go over that. We are tied to our employer to do the dirty job, and we do not have the same rights as a Canadian. In fact, we are denied basic human rights and basic labor standards. Is that a just program? Is that a fair program? Not at all. As a result of that unjust program, unjust policies, being a migrant farm worker means that you face 20 injustices in Canada. I do not have time to tell you all those 20 injustices, but let me tell you one of them. Our housing. First of all, our housing is isolated. We live on the farm. That's why you do not hear, that's why you do not know our story. We are isolated. That's one. Number two, our housing is overcrowded. And that is being overcrowded. What does that do? Can that help with physical distancing, social distancing? That is why COVID is spreading so fast and easily among farm workers, because our housing is overcrowded. And in a lot of cases, those housing are below standard, and in a lot of cases, they are not regulated. So let me talk about the deaths that we've had in Leamington. In Ontario, they have been free. The most recent one was in Simcoe County. And the strange thing about those deaths, they're very young guys, 24, 31, very young guys. That is one. Number two, these guys come to Canada, these migrant workers come to Canada as the breadwinner. They are the ones, and you see, that is what COVID is doing. It is not just exposing the difficult conditions, it is also showing you that the people of being a migrant worker in Canada, you are forced not to just put up your health, not to you're not risking only your health, but as you can see, we are also risking our lives because we put the economic situation of our family to provide for our families. That is so important to us that we put our life on the line. And what is Canada doing with it? Imagine pre-COVID or when serious measures were being considered, that the borders were being closed. The borders were closed, and it was open only to citizens and permanent residents. And it didn't take long for the Prime Minister to turn around and open the borders for migrant farm workers. Why? Because the farmers, they're so powerful, they're the lobbies. They lobby the government. Basically, they control the government. And who are the politicians loyal to? You, the voter, me, the worker, or their donors. And who are their donors? And they are the ones that the politicians are loyal to. And that is what COVID is showing, that the politicians are loyal to their donors. And our employers, the farmers, they control the government. They influence policy. There's so much power in their hands. So, are all the protocols in place? Is there oversight for farm workers? Not at all. The farmers have, so basically they have everything in their power to do whatever they want. There is no oversight to see that all the protocols are being followed for migrant workers, and that is why COVID, basically the COVID-19, the epicenter for that disease right now, that virus right now, it is with migrant workers. Why is that so? Because the policies and the policies and practices that are in place, they are not aligned to physically distance and to keep migrant farm workers safe. At the end of the day, the policies that are there is policies that promote profit for the employers and not to promote the health and safety of migrant workers. I need to tell you a couple of things. One, In the 1940s, Canada opened its borders for people of European descent. Once they got it, that they got status upon arrival, and other Europeans, when it came, it didn't take them long to get status, and they even got land on the border. But when it came to people of color, then everything changed. Everything changed, and in fact, yesterday was an important day in Canada's history. Canada celebrated 153 years. Canada was built on the backbone of migrant workers. And you all are familiar with the Chinese railroad workers. That these people were used and abused, and at the end they were refused to build Canada, when Canada was expanded, right? And at the end, these people were refused. And from that time, over 100 years, Canada has been using immigration laws, unjust immigration laws, and unjust labor laws to keep migrant workers vulnerable and precarious. And how do we fight with that? How do we fight against those things? How do we fight against those unjust laws? Let me tell you a second injustice. Out of the 20 I told you about how it is, I'm going to tell you another one. It is illegal for migrant farm workers to unionize. It is illegal for migrant farm workers to unionize. Can you believe that in Canada? A land that portrays itself as a champion for human rights, it is illegal to be associated with a union, migrant farm workers. Why is that so? In a country that portrays itself as a champion for human rights. So the question is, how do we fight against that? How do we offer our resistance? How do we fight that? And we do what is called creative organizing. And in our books, we use 101 different tricks. There's no one trick. We just being creative to organize and fight that. And for you, what can you do? What can you do? There's so many things that you can do. But at the end of the day, between you and I, in my personal opinion, I'll be happy if you do that thing, whatever skill, whatever talent that you have, and you're passionate about it. I would be happy if you can use that skill, that talent, to move people. Because our fight is to fight back against those unjust laws and policies. And so if you can use your talent and your skills to motivate people, to inspire people to action, that would be a victory. And our fight is a people's fight, a social fight, a people's movement, a social movement. And use the skills, use the talent to push people to action. Because at the end of the day, the politicians will say, oh, that's not an issue in my riding. That's not an issue. And that is what's lacking. People pressure. So we need you to do those things that you're passionate about. So to push people to action, to pressure the politicians, to change those unjust laws and policies, and to bring fairness and equality in society. And that is what COVID is doing. COVID is exposing all the cracks that are in our society. And you know what it's doing? It is now exposing those things that all activists know. We know these things for 100 years, we know that. But COVID is pushing it up the agenda. Will you join that fight? Will you use your skills, your passion to push up these issues up the agenda and create social justice, to create fairness in our society that is generally portrayed itself as Canada and North America is portrayed as the land of the free and the American dream, and you can achieve for everybody, and that is just a gimmick, right? And in truth and in fact, it is not an equal opportunity for all. So in a nutshell, that is my contribution. I'm open to any questions. I hope you read me clearly, because I am not home. I end up working late today, and I wasn't able to participate the right way that I would like, and because I like to interact and I like to participate in my faith. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Gabrielle. I think it was very enlightening to, have firsthand, sort of the oppression that happens. I think a key thing was, you emphasizing the fact that it is illegal for these migrant farm workers to be unionizing, and I was a witness to this myself, because I remember a collaboration that we did with migrantdreams.ca, which is a migrant workers organization. I remember having to do some creative organizing, wherein we basically had to take them out of their quarters because they're sort of closely guarded, and for them to be in a safe location, and there they were able to anonymously share their lives through artwork, and that was able to speak to an audience here in Vancouver, and hopefully that became like an open conversation for folks to think about, where their food is coming from, and to have those conversations. So it's not just enough that you eat local, but you also want to make sure under what kind of labor conditions these are under. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for the panelists for sharing for sharing your expertise and your own experiences. And now, with the help of our technical producer, Kurt Young, let's hear some questions from our online audience.
All right, so our first question comes from Ellen Ramsey, and she asked, how is the COVID crisis affecting the flow of migrant workers into Canada, and how is it affecting the workers' lives? The next question is from Barry Weisletter, and he asks, what is the record of the unions like UFCW and Unifor in organizing and representing the interests of migrant workers? And yeah, I'll say that we'll take those as our two questions for right now.
Okay.
I guess I can try to look at these other questions, and then I will move it over to the panel. As for Ellen's question, how is COVID affecting migrant workers and their lives? And I think that definitely, with the borders being closed, definitely there's much more complexities around the movement of migrant workers. Specifically, I think when the borders also started to close, given the status of a lot of these temporary foreign workers, there was a lot of confusion around them that they could not return to Canada when the borders started closing. And that was weeks after. So we did receive a lot of concerns, like, say, for instance, a lot of them, specifically from our experience, were care workers who had to go with their employers who were on vacation somewhere else and join their employers in that vacation. And so, they had to remain in those countries where they're at and had to sort of wait. So there was no clarity around that. And then again, it shows again sort of the disadvantages of these workers having different status, right? Instead of just giving them permanent resident status. And I think it's also affecting their livelihood. Recently, there's a local union, Local 40 here in Vancouver, that is geared towards hospitality workers. And one Filipino migrant worker, her name is Nim Calves, she did speak in the CBC about, about how CERB is potentially covering for this this period, but then, what would happen after this period is done, now that the borders are closed and now that the tourism industry is basically dead, as long as the borders are closed. So she did pose a question about, like, what is the long-term solution of this government in order for them to continue to be able to support themselves, but also focusing her status as a breadwinner for her family back in the Philippines. And unfortunately, with her speaking on the CBC, it was met with, number one, a lot of racist tirades against her. Basically everyone is telling her to go back to the Philippines and that she is ungrateful for the things that being given to her. But what was worse was, in a few days, we actually saw a surge of Filipino migrant workers themselves calling her out and basically telling her that she's ungrateful and that she should just be thankful about what's given to them. And I think this is a very important thing to bring up, because sometimes the oppression leads to folks thinking that these are their rights and this is what they deserve, when they deserve more and that they have a right to advocate for their rights. And I think that's also stemming from their own fears that if someone speaks up, then their opportunities will also be affected. So you can see sort of the effects of this exploitative system being pervasive, is that it immobilizes people to speak up and to speak up for their fellow workers. I'm not sure exactly about the history of labor unions, but I think, as Gabrielle has mentioned, I think the most precarious of these are the temporary foreign workers, and unfortunately, as they are not covered by unions, I'm not exactly sure how they're being supported. So those are my answers to those. I don't know if Paulina or Gabrielle have things to add about these two questions.
Yes, for the Filipino community, that's why I mentioned the Filipinos, the Filipino workers in overseas workers are called modern heroes in the Philippines because of all the remittances propping up the economy of the Philippines. But then now with COVID-19, they are not given the support in the country where they are working. So the government took so much time for them to get them back to the Philippines, and when they did, they are they are even now just treated as garbage. They don't have a quarantine place, so they are just left there in the airport, and they have to sleep there in the airport, and some are being treated as criminals. So that's how the life of an overseas workers, temporary or not, are having this with COVID times. And I agree with Gabriel when he's saying, with the COVID times pandemic, it highlighted the issues that most migrant workers are already suffering, and this is the opportunity to really highlight that and let the people understand how the situation of the migrant workers are really in, even before COVID strike us. So, for example, the example of the long term, you mentioned about the long term homes, nursing homes, and you mentioned about the long-term nursing homes where most of the workers, line workers, are minimum wage workers, and a lot of the temporary workers or foreign workers there are Filipinos, because a lot of them came from the Philippines, and they felt discriminated too, because now they are being accused of spreading the COVID-19, because they are moving from one housing to another. And then one anecdote that people shared to me is that with the COVID-19, the government has announced that all health workers will have their like an additional benefit for them working, right? And a lot of the healthcare allied professionals, like the physiotherapist assistant, they didn't get that in the province of Ontario anyway. So they had this struggle too. So in terms of the unions, I know that unions, particularly also in 2008, I've been working with the Toronto and New York Labor Council, Region Labor Council, and I am an organizer for the Filipino Workers Network. And I know that this issue about temporary foreign workers was one part of the conference that we had in 2016, and they have supported and endorsed the statement that we had for Filipino workers. Some of the specific unions that have been working with the migrant workers are the Union of Food and Commercial Workers. They set up 8 regional offices to provide support and advocacy to temporary foreign workers, particularly the seasonal farm workers. The steel workers are also playing a positive role in supporting organizing efforts of domestic workers and other migrant workers. And the Migrante Ontario, I mean, yeah. So those are the two of the unions that are supporting the struggle of the temporary foreign workers.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you for this great question. These are deep questions. These are powerful questions. It will take me the whole night to answer that. But let me say as briefly as I can. Let me see if I can attempt to answer as briefly as possible. First of all, I want to say that the food that you eat can be the safest form of your medicine. And it can also be the slowest form of your poison. I want to tell you that the Canadian law, it makes it legal for the exploitation of the soil, for the exploitation of the environment, and for the exploitation of migrant farm workers. I want to tell you that would you believe me or would you agree that there is sufficient resources in the world, sufficient for everybody's need and not enough for anybody's greed. And that is why it is estimated that in the Philippines, every day 8,000 people is estimated to be living in the Philippines to travel around the world as a migrant worker. And to me, there's no such word as being a migrant worker. I'll tell you why. I was forced to come to Canada. Migrant workers are forced to leave the country. And why is that so? It's simply because I just told you that the world has sufficient resources for everybody's needs. But the world is designed in such a way that there is global inequality. Global inequality. And because of global inequality, and that's human-made, these are not natural phenomena. These are human-made stuff that design the world in such a way that the majority of the resources are in the hands of the very few. And this is what is forcing us to leave our country. That's one. Number two, Canada takes part in so many things, right? They go to other countries and extract and displace people from the land and so many things. And if you look at me, I was forced to come to Canada. Why? Because of a hurricane. Who are the countries that are causing global warming and climate change? The rich countries are the ones, and who are the ones paying the price? We from the smaller, the global south. So being a migrant means that you're forced, and there's no such word to me as migrant. We are forced to leave our countries to work. That's one. In terms of a while ago, earlier in my presentation, I told you we do not only sacrifice our health, but we also sacrifice our life just to provide for our families. And very, very, very few workers are willing to bold enough, or because of the situation, they can say, no, I will stay home and I will not come to Canada. Very few, because the way the program is designed, it makes you dependent on it. You cannot live without it. And you know how many workers are willing to come to Canada right now? But because of flights and so many logistics, I do not know, and visa and paperwork stuff, that is why they're still caught up. So the virus has prevented the inflow, the great inflow, simply because of the flights are not normal and the paperwork or the embassies are closed. That is the key thing, right? But trust me, because of the economic situation, unemployment is high in those countries that provide Canada's migrant workers. Unemployment is high, and most people are ready and eager to come up, and they don't mind putting their health on the line, but also their life on the line, because they know that without the work in Canada, that the family will be below the poverty line. And in terms of USPW and UNIFOR, I need to say that USPW, I know, is providing tremendous help. Because right now, the government is trying to provide open work permits for migrant workers. We have a closed work permit we are trying to employ, but only now, certain migrant workers who can complain, who can prove that they've been treated unfairly, that they can apply for open work permit, and USPW is providing that. But what makes USPW different from my group is USPW is a union. We are not a union. That's one. Number two, USPW is a union, but we are a political collective. We are fearless, and we are fearless, and we take on the politicians. That's what makes us set us apart from all unions and all other groups. Right? We are political. We do not take money from them, and that is the other thing with Canada. The people who provide it, your funding, they tend to control your agenda, and that is why nobody can control us, because we do not think we are careful who provides us for this. In terms of UNIFOR, I need to tell you that UNIFOR is a very strong ally of our group. Why? UNIFOR in Canada, being a migrant worker is one thing, but being of color in Canada, that's a better thing. You know the injustices that people of color face in Canada. So UNIFOR can identify with our struggles, because UNIFOR has a group, indigenous, people of color, and so on. I can't remember the exact wording, but people of color, they have a separate group within UNIFOR to fight for equality and fairness at the workplace of people of color. So UNIFOR can identify with the issues that migrant workers face. I've attended webinars with them, and in August we'll be having other webinars for UNIFOR, the organizing with their members across the country to get the members inspired and motivated to act. Also, Unifor is a strong ally. Also, QP, OPSU. These are all the unions that really support us head on, right? They're head and shoulders with us. And the CBTU, what is it? Canadian Black Trade Union. They too, they stand with us head and shoulders because again, these are people of color. They identify us, they identify our issues, and they fight with us still. And at the end of the day, a union is as strong as its members, and they always invite migrant workers to speak. And talking about that, look at that's another thing COVID is exposing. COVID is exposing in the long-term care sector. Somebody said it nicely. COVID is exposing the dirty tricks of Canada. That's in the long-term care sector. What COVID is doing to us, it is exposing all the injustices that migrant workers face. And look at that.
1 minute.
Silence is a powerful thing. Look at that. Look at how this is impacting migrant workers. But yesterday you cannot hear them on the air. Why? Because in Canada, country that portrays itself as a place of freeness and openness and fairness, no migrant worker is able to speak up at those sessions like tonight or the radio station. Why? Because the fear of deportation. We face a lot of injustices, and that is what COVID is doing. That the injustices, even in the middle of the virus, that the workers cannot speak because of fear of being sent back. There's so much power in the hands of the choice. So I'm telling you, your action is really, really important because there's power in your hands, not only as a consumer, not only as a voter, but also as somebody who's right. There's so much power in your hands. So push the politicians, use your skills, use your talent, identify your strong point, your talent, and use it to change, to transform society. And that is why I want to congratulate the organizers. It's all the people who are concerned about fairness and equality to organize such a forum. And to you, the listeners, there's so much power in your hands, and thank you so much.
So thank you for that. Are there other questions, Kurt, from our audience? I think we're just going through some of the questions.
Sorry, yeah. I muted myself. I said we have enough questions for 3 rounds, another 2 rounds. So okay. I'm gonna go to Daniel Terade because our next 2 questions are from people who've already asked questions, and Karen Lewis has her question is tied to one of the previous questions. So I'm just gonna get back to her in a little bit. But the way I'm going to do it, I'm starting with Daniel Terade, and the question is, there are petty bourgeois farmers, family farms, and industrial farms run by capitalists. Both use migrant labor. Should our demands, e.g. seizing land, differ based on the class nature of the farm? Then I'm going to go back to Barry Wiseletter's second question, and he asks, how are migrant farm workers recruited to travel and work? Do recruitment agents rip off migrants? How do farmers escape the duty of to protect and test workers for COVID? And then now we're on Karen Lewis's question. She says, to add to Barry's last question, what are the migrant workers' expectations versus reality when coming to Canada? And how much does the American-Canadian dream play into their recruitment? So those are the questions for this round.
I guess I can start with the first question on sort of the petty bourgeois and bourgeois farmers and what kind of, I guess, like how what that would look like in terms of the resistance to bigger industries. I think that it's still important. I think at the end of the day, it is a class struggle, and even though these are small scale like farm owners, I think it's still important for them to sort of have that awareness. I would liken this even to, like, to temporary foreign workers that are in caregiving, right? A lot of the clients here, or sort of the ones providing the salaries for these employees, are are probably like middle class bourgeois people as well, providing employment for these care workers. So I think it's also important to see that they are very. It's important for them, I guess, to sort of have that awareness how they're very much part of this oppressive system and that they're benefiting from the labor of these people. As to like a specific way of how that goes, I would say for these folks, I think it would be more of like an awareness, and as opposed to, I guess, like bigger corporations and bigger companies that are basically, I would say, in connivance with legislators and people who make our laws in such ways that that will allow them to explore these exploitative practices. So I think it's important that they're doing that, and in fact, I would contest that they're probably also aware of this. So it's important that I think we know that workers are aware of this kind of exploitation that happens and that it needs to be addressed. As to how farm migrant workers are recruited and what that process looks like, I will move that over to Gabrielle later, and probably Pauline also has some views on that. But my experience is mostly with care workers, and they're very much recruited in a similar way of like usually agencies in their home countries, where they pay these exorbitant fees. Sometimes they're even cheated out of the system. Sometimes they're provided with fake documents that renders them without status when they move to their host countries, thus making them more vulnerable to exploitation. I can imagine it's probably similar, but I will let Gabrielle and Pauline take on that. And the last question on what migrant workers' expectations are like as opposed to the conditions that they face here. I think that's quite a complex question, and maybe that will depend on the class of migrant workers. Like I could say specifically, and I think it's very important that I am glad that Gabrielle brought that up, that this is a class and a race issue. Even for non-temporary foreign workers, like say for instance for the skilled worker program, what I'm noticing is that people of color and these workers that are coming from these countries that are more coming from these developing countries, they have a lot of issues about how their education credentials are considered in Canada. A lot of them are turned down to jobs that are commensurate to their education and work experience because they lack Canadian experience, but the same doesn't apply to, say, for instance, people from Western Europe or from Australia or from these countries, from these other rich imperialist countries as well. So you can see definitely the differentiation. So while there is like sort of an immigration point system that happens when you apply with Canadian immigration that basically takes into account your education, your work experience, it somewhat gives you a semblance that they will be matching you to the job that you actually that actually matches your skills and experience. But when you get here, you do not meet that. And then to emphasize too, a lot of people would be thinking that temporary foreign workers have less education and experience. But say, for instance, I can speak to a lot of the Filipino caregivers in temporary foreign worker programs. A lot of them are actually university and college graduates who actually have advanced degrees, either like in nursing, medicine, and other degrees. But because of the lack of opportunities that are available in the Philippines, and as Pauline mentioned, because of the labor export policy, then they don't have any choice but to apply to these programs that leads them towards exploitation. And while the temporary foreign worker program for caregivers has a pathway towards permanent residence, which is unfortunately not available in the temporary foreign workers for those in the agricultural stream, for seasonal workers, they're not able to advance themselves, because then they would be relegated to similarly level jobs as when they were caregivers. So they will continue to have like lower pay. And once their family moves in, not having that status will continue to place them in the lower classes, thus again perpetuating this thing. So it does sell, like what they're saying, it does sell sort of that dream of prosperity or being able to send money to their home countries. But it's very much sort of this disillusionment that happens when they get here. So I think that's very important to emphasize. I will pass it on to Gabrielle to further comment on the questions.
Okay, beautiful. These are powerful questions. These are deep questions. These are amazing questions and relevant, right? I don't know if I remember all of them, but in terms of the family farm concept and operation, okay, if you take, for example, with COVID, when there was outbreak of COVID and those meat processing plants, right, it was only then Canada got to question about how the food system is set up. And I'll tell you what, in America too, they said that generally the large corporations, the meat processing plants are owned by large corporations. Can you imagine what would happen to our food system? Can you imagine what would happen to our food system if all our food is controlled by very few large corporations? And then I think COVID is also going, right? At one time at a very important session, somebody came up with the idea or came up with that information, very thought-provoking. It is said that at any minute in the world, there's sufficient food to last us for 3 months. Can you imagine what will happen? Have you during COVID, have you ever wondered about your food, where your food is coming from during that critical time, a time where most people are not working? Can you imagine that the role that migrant workers have played in our food system? But in Canada, the concept of family farm is very important, very important. And when you go to the farmer's market, it's always the white hand that is serving you. But you do not see the whole story. The people of color who are in the back, hidden at the back on the farm doing the dirty work. You do not see that, and that is what Canada is using. And also because of the concept of family farms, that is why they use those unjust labor laws, because we do not get overtime pay, which is an injustice that migrant farm workers say. We do not get overtime pay, and that has to do with the concept of the farm being family farm. If it is family farm, how can you have laws to include overtime pay in family-run farms, right? So it's a whole web of a carefully crafted system just to these guys and to benefit a few people. So, in terms of the bourgeoisie system, I'm still learning about that. I cannot speak of everything, but I'm still learning along the way. But the concept of family farm, that is something that is a misconception, and that is something Canadian agriculture is involved in some, but we are still caught up in that whole concept of family farms, right? And also, too, I need to tell you, especially in the cities, the more remote, the further you move away from the land, from the production of your food, the more disconnected you are, the more ignorant we become of the realities that are involved in the production of our food, right? And the question is, are you concerned? Are you concerned whether your food is being produced by those who respect the soil, respect the environment, and respect the workers? Or are you not concerned whether people exploit the soil, exploit the environment, exploit the workers? That is the important question. The other one that I remembered is the question of recruitment. In countries like my country, there are roughly about 1,000 migrant farm workers in Canada from my country. So all the paperwork is done. The recruiting is done through my government. So my government does all the paperwork for the migrant farm workers. And that's the ironical thing for me, because my government is involved. I was thinking that, everything is legal, everything is right. And I used to think, I don't know, I used to be naive, I think. I used to think that when something is legal, it was right. It was just, I used to think so. Not until I came on the program. And to be honest, it is because of your silence. Because Canada is such a gentleman on the world stage, a quiet, a gentle person, right? According to a friend of mine in Canada, he said Canada is known for polite genocide. And that is why I am in Canada. Nobody speaks about those injustices. Everybody's quiet about it. And in my country, no news is good news. If you don't hear the bad things, it's no news. You don't hear anything about Canada, so it's no news. So no news in my country is good news. And we don't hear anything about Canada. But in America, we hear about the bad things. So America is portrayed as a bad guy, and Canada is portrayed as a good guy. That is why when I came to Canada, my expectations were that high, because the country that on the world stage presents itself as a champion for human rights. That is the impression we have. And none of the workers will talk about anything bad about the program. But it's only when I got there I realized there's a big gap, a huge gap between reality on the ground, the reality that I experienced, and what I was expecting. That huge gap is what I call the 20 dark side of Canada. Sorry. In terms of recruiting, in countries like the Philippines, I said it is estimated that within 8,000 workers leave the Philippines every day. Because of the large quantity of workers, the Philippines, Thailand, Guatemala, Mexico, there are lots of recruiters because it's a large volume of workers. So there are lots of recruiters, and they're not just recruiters, we need an adjective. They are unscrupulous. And they prey on our ignorance. Because you see, that's what capitalism is about. Capitalism brings a lot of fear in people, and also they paint the picture really bright, right? All that glitter is gold. They paint it so bright that you can make a fortune in the American dream is painted for you by those recruiters. Only when you get there that you see that the things that you were promised is not true, and you incur debt to come to Canada when you go for the recruiters, and you have those debt hanging on your head, and you have those basically their hands in your pocket. So the recruitment is a real devil. In fact, being a migrant worker in Canada, you've been milked. Migrant workers in Canada have been milked by the government, by the system, by the recruiters, by everybody, by our employers. We have been milked, and that is why being a migrant worker, it means that you're trapped in the vicious cycle of poverty and social ills. We are trapped in that vicious cycle of poverty because we have been milked. The laws are against us. We are living a country of higher employment. We come to a country that's exploiting us, and the whole system is designed to exploit us. And to make it worse, we do not have an open work permit. We depend on our employers. To make it worse, we do not know our rights, and there are very few rights for us. And to make it work, Canadians are silent. All of that is happening in a country with culture of silence, and all of those things are legal. And that is the reality of being a migrant worker in Canada. In terms of our expectations, as I said, we don't know anything bad about Canada, anything bad, and because your expectation, you don't know anything bad, that raises your expectation. Oh yeah, here's an opportunity. I'm going to Canada to earn something decent and to turn my life around, to transform my life, to improve my life, to improve my family's life. And in truth and in fact, it does not work out. So it's only to find out that you get yourself in a trap and in a whole web that is so difficult to get out of. And there are other questions. I don't know if I picked them up along the way, but in a nutshell, this is the thing I remember.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights, Gabriel. Do we have more questions, Kurt, from our audience?
So these are our 3 final questions. So the first one is from Peter de Gama. Or am I right? Is Peter asked a question? He says migrantdreams.ca campaign to call PM Trudeau full immigration status for all. So it's not a question. It was bringing attention to something. And our last 2 questions are from Ellen Ramsey. First one she asks is, how dependent is Canada on the labor of migrant workers? Is it increasing or decreasing? Have wages been going up in the migrant worker sector? Are they unionized? Well, that question has already been answered. And the second one is, Vancouver used Mexican migrant labor to help build the Canada Line rapid transit route. Are migrant workers still working in this sector in Canada?
Okay, I can try to answer some of these questions. So from Peter, I know it was a comment, but it was about sort of this movement, migrantdreams.ca. I know specifically here in Vancouver, a local MLA, her name is Mabel Elmore, and she is of Filipino heritage as well. She's supporting this initiative. So we do have some support as well from the legislature around this. And basically, as we've addressed and how Gabrielle and Paulina has emphasized, is the fact that these folks don't have status makes it more difficult for them to be able to speak up. even to unionize, right, and to be afforded sort of these basic human rights that workers enjoy in Canada. So I think it's very important that we support this. So I would encourage everyone to check out that and see the different ways that you can support this petition. As for Ellen Ramsey's question about how dependent Canada is, well, like I said, it's very dependent. I mentioned earlier that since 2006, basically, we've already, well, they're not only dependent towards migrant labor, I think they're also dependent towards temporary or cheaper exploitative labor. As I mentioned earlier, since 2006, due to the change in Canadian immigration policies, there are now more migrant workers coming in with temporary status, more than the number of economic immigrants that are granted permanent resident status. So basically, this makes it complicated, and this definitely continues this exploitative process. And as I've emphasized earlier in my discussion, it's about also like the bigger systems at play, right? And Pauline mentioned in a lot of developing countries, there's this labor export policy, and this is part of the bigger capitalistic imperialistic complex, which basically means that it's exploiting developing countries' labor, whether in their home countries or in these host rich imperialist countries. So wherever they're located, they're continuously exploited for the sake of accruing capital. So I think it's very important that, of course, specifically for migrant workers, we need to fight for their status so that they're also able to mobilize and not just gain or seek these alliances and be able to advocate for themselves and defend their rights. But also, like, at the end of the day, they're very much part of this bigger system, bigger oppressive system that needs to be addressed. So I think as internationalists and socialists, we need to address that as well. I'm not exactly sure how they're involved with construction for the expansion on the transportation system. So unfortunately, I cannot comment on that. I guess we could go to either Gabrielle or Paulina if you wanted to comment on these questions, and also maybe to share some of your final insights as we're about to wrap up as well.
Paulina here. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm answering the questions, but I wanted to just say that we are so dependent on the migrant workers or even migrant population, because in Canada, our birth rate is about 0. So we need a lot of workers to come in to support all our programs for the seniors. And like Gabriel said, the migrant workers are the backbone of this country's economy, because with the program with the pension and everything, they needed the workforce to support the people who will be going on retirement or on Pension. And also, I just wanted to reiterate that the call, since I've known about the migrant workers' struggle, the call was always to get landed status for migrant workers. And I know that there's also, I think, one party, NDP party, with during Olivia Chow, that there was the addition of, if you are bringing migrant workers, that they should be able to bring their families with them, because the problem of isolation and loneliness and that really gives a lot of emotional stress as well to the workers, which is something that is highlighted with the COVID-19 crisis, where people here in Canada, the citizens of Canada, they complain that they haven't seen their seniors, they haven't seen the people who are in the long-term housing. But remember, how would you feel now that you have a worker here in Canada who hasn't seen their family for so long, and everything that their family is going through is in another country, and they don't even know how to help them, because they are helping people who are here. And I think, yeah. So in terms of my parting words, I think it's really important to unite. I know that the migrant workers, because they are not citizens of the country yet, it's difficult for them to really vote people that will carry their agenda to the policy making table. So it's important to have that voice. So either we do a lot of advocacy to the government elected officials, and to change the policies that the country has. And I know that there's two examples that the Filipino community has done for the migrant workers. The one was the LCP, where they have changed I think they changed a policy that the domestic workers or the live-in caregivers will have the pathway to a permanent residence. And the other one was the changes also on LCP on the Wana Tihada law, and it was a policy making uh, campaign, and it highlights that we have a lot to work in terms of uniting the labor, the community, and even the migrant workers as well, to push that so that it becomes a policy changing thing at the parliament or the policy table, right? So thank you for allowing me to be part of the conversation tonight. And thank you, Jeremiah. And thank you, Gabriel, for all the experiences that you have provided. It enlightened me as well. So good night.
So we're also, if Gabrielle has any final comments or about the questions, and also some parting words for our audience.
Beautiful. Thank you for this great opportunity. Quickly, I want to say everybody should be familiar that Canada relies on migrant workers and are under the temporary foreign workers. It is estimated like 60,000 workers come to Canada as temporary foreign workers. And I think between Quebec and Ontario, they have the largest chunk, but they are spread across all across the country. That's one. So there are different programs that bring workers to Canada. And I've been a migrant farm worker. There are 20 injustices that we face. And I want to tell you, 20 injustices. And those 20 injustices are at every level of government, at the federal level, at the provincial level, at the municipal level, every level. The whole system is designed to exploit people. And that is why, and as I said earlier, Canada have been using unjust immigration laws, unjust labor laws to keep migrant workers vulnerable and precarious. From the Chinese, over 100 years, Canada have been using that. And that is why we are asking for status. And what does status mean? So when you talk up to a Canadian about status, they only think about to living in Canada. That's not what our objective is, to live in Canada. That's not our objective. Status is that thing. Status is that only one thing that will help us to take care of both our immigration vulnerability and our labor vulnerability. Once you have status, it takes care of that immigration, that vulnerability that we have. Once you have started, you can get an open work permit. You're not tied to an abusive employer. And that is why we call it status. Status to a migrant worker means that thing that will help us to access decent work. Status to a migrant worker means that thing that will help us to access fairness, to access equality. That's what status means. And it also means being reunited with our family. The program separates us from our family. That's what status really means to us. And not just living in Canada. It is that thing that will help us to be treated fairly at work, to have an open work permit, to leave an abusive employer, to get a better employer, to get a better paid job. Somebody also asked a question about the pay. If you remember that in Ontario, and as I said, we face injustices at every level of government. Which government that says that minimum wage should stay at $14 and not go up to $15? And who are the people getting minimum wage? It's the same people of color, the same migrant workers, and the same people who are impacted most by COVID-19. And that's another thing that COVID is proving. That the government and the media and everybody talking about essential workers, frontline workers and so on, but yet still they consider migrant farm workers to be essential and frontline workers, but yet still their pay is minimum. And imagine on a farm, minimum wage we get. And imagine on a farm with so many sick workers, they're now employing, they try to recruit Canadians, and they're offering them $25 an hour. $25. And how much is a migrant worker getting? Only $14. And it is well documented that the work that the migrant worker does, the migrant farm worker does, it will take 2 Canadians, 3 Canadians, 4, maybe 6 Canadians to do the amount of work that we do, we produce in a day. Another thing, I would like to draw everybody's attention to other documentaries like Migrant Dreams, which you can watch on TVO. They would highlight some of the injustices that we talk about, and we do not have time to get into much detail. Migrant Dreams. There's also El Contrato that you can watch. And at the end of the day, I want to say thanks to the organizers. As I said, and I cannot stop saying that, it's only organizers who are concerned about equality, who are concerned about fairness with organizers, such like that. And it is only an audience who are concerned about fairness and taking action who ask those quick questions. And I just want to end with those 2 things. One, a great guy said, it's a famous quote, a great guy said, the world will not be destroyed, or the world suffers a lot. I write this one. The world suffers a lot, not because of the violence of bad people, but because of the silence of good people. And the last thing I want to tell you, there's power in your hand, and you have power to transform the world. You have the power to transform society. Will you consider what is that thing that you're passionate about and use that power to transform the people that you come into contact with and transform society in a country and change society in a country that is a society to a society of fairness and equality. Isn't that what we want? What is life? Living life in fear and living life in hope. And the world has sufficient resources for everybody to live a life of hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle, for those thoughts. And I really learned a lot from both of our panelists today, Paulina and Gabrielle. Thank you so much. To wrap up, again, I think it just reinforces the fact that the state in connivance with capitalists have these oppressive labor and immigration policies that continue to exploit these migrant workers. And I think it's important for us to speak up. And while it is important for us to be allies as workers to these temporary foreign workers, until they have status, the way that they can advocate for themselves and the way that they can mobilize to fight for their rights will be quite limited. So I think I really agree with both our panelists that is definitely the big first step that will allow them to be able to unionize and be able to advocate for their rights. And again, I would also like to bring to sort of the bigger picture that, again, this is part of the larger imperialist and capitalist complex. As long as there are these rich imperialist countries and big capitalists that continue to exploit cheap labor from these developing countries, then whether it's migrant workers or workers in their home countries will continue to be exploited. So this needs to be explored. As long as our ways of distributing resources and addressing the needs of people around the world are done through like a profit agenda, then this kind of exploitation will continue, because again, the bottom line counts over the wellness of people. So I think that's important to always emphasize as internationalists and socialists. And again, like earlier, I talked about as well, like when I did the land acknowledgement, that it's important as settlers in this land, as immigrant workers, that we also align with indigenous folk, because the same struggle of colonialism and the continuous imperialist and capitalist structure is very much like the same structure that displaced these displaced indigenous folk, as well as people of color, away from their home countries and now being exploited in this rich imperialist countries. So again, would like to thank Paulina and Gabrielle for their insights. I learned a lot from your wisdom, your expertise, and also your lived experiences, and to our wonderful producer, Kurt Young in Mississauga, and to everyone who participated in tonight's conversation. please consider buying and supporting a subscription to Socialist Action newspaper, which is only for $25 for 1 year and it's delivered to your door. To fill out the form, you can visit our website at www.socialistactioncanada.ca. Again, that's www.socialistactioncanada.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining Socialist Action, write to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com. That's socialistactioncanada@gmail.com. Or you can also go old school and just call us at 647-986-1917. Again, that's 647-986-1917. If you like this webcast, we invite you to attend our other webcasts in the future. During the pandemic, we've been usually doing them every Sunday and Thursday. And the best way to be posted about these shows would be to subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. You can click the subscribe button, and you can also make sure that the notification bell is on so that you're posted and updated with all our future shows. So from all of us, we hope that you learned a lot from today, and thank you so much for your questions and your engagement. And we hope that you keep safe during this time. Thank you.